Have you ever found yourself facing a seemingly unassailable obstacle? I know that I have, and I'm sure that many of you have as well. And whether it's a graduate school application or a relationship that can't be salvaged, we know that there are times in our lives and foes in our lives that push us to the brink of despair. And it is in times like these that we need a calm demeanor and a steely resolve that will give us the strength to move forward. For the British people during World War II, this took the form of one man. That man was Winston Churchill. As a former lifelong friend and as a former confidant of Winston Churchill, I'm here today and I'm qualified to speak to you on just why he deserves this award I'm going to present him. But first, let's look at his accomplishments not just as a leader, but as a soldier for the British Army. Next, let's look at his legacy and impact that he left not just on Great Britain, but on the entire world. And last, let's look at just why he deserves this most courageous leadership award, and we'll come to see why he is so deserving and long overdue for it as well. But first, let's look at some of his accomplishments that he accumulated throughout his long and historic life. Churchill's early years saw him in 4 different continents in the British Army, and as an infantryman and as a cavalier for the Army during the Second Boer War in South Africa. And during this war, he was captured and imprisoned. And even though, despite being in this terrible circumstance, he used his intellect and his resolve to not just escape, but to come back to Great Britain with a hero's return. And according to an article titled Character Traits of Winston Churchill, he argued that in this piece that he knew that he was lucky, that there was some reason why he was led to come back, and that he felt that he was being preserved for bigger and larger times. And so, after his time in the Army, what he did was he vacillated between being in politics and being also in the military. He served during World War I and is an important soldier in that war. And as he came back from World War I, he served on the post-war coalition that strongly advocated for a prolonged disarmament of Germany. His opinion was in the minority. And this minority opinion, although unpopular at the time, was proven later to be very forward-thinking and very forthright in his opinion. And so after we saw his resignation from this council, and it took a long time for Winston Churchill to have the ability to come back into the spotlight. And unfortunately for Churchill, this would come at a very dark time. In 1940, after Hitler had swept across much of Europe, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided that, you know what, based off my appeasement policies, I'm not fit to be Prime Minister of Britain. And so they looked then to an individual who they knew would stand up to Germany, who would strongly go against Hitler and would not be afraid to fight back against him. This man, Winston Churchill. And so from 1940 to 1945, Winston Churchill served as the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And his most famous times came during Great Britain's darkest hours. From 1940 to 1941, there was known as the Battle of Britain, which took place between the Royal British Air Force and the German Air Force. And during this time, the hopes for the Allies were at stake, and they were swinging in the balance based off of how the Royal Air Force performed. And Winston Churchill certainly played his part. From 1940 to 1941, during this time period, he gave 2 of the most iconic speeches in the history of wartime. First was the blood, sweat, and tears speech, where he talked about the resolve and the dignity that was needed to keep up the war effort in Great Britain, to not let the onslaught of the German Air Force stop them from believing in victory. Next was perhaps his most famous, and that is known as the Darkest Hour Address. And he gave this speech during the time period in which it looked like Great Britain might lose the Battle of Britain and therefore be invaded by the German army. However, based in part by the strength of his words and by the passion in which he gave them, he gave the British people the resolve, and he gave the Royal Air Force the ability to be empowered. And eventually they did defeat the Germans and therefore swung the tide of World War II during 1941. And so, now that we've seen just what type of accomplishments that Winston Churchill accumulated during this time, let's now look at the legacy and the impact that he leaves on the Western world. When you look at, for example, in 1940 to 1941, what you see was a leader who had his personal character greatly tested. And according to a first-hand account of Churchill that was published in 2005, his resilience and his steadfast belief in the righteousness of the Allied cause in World War II gave millions hope. and it gave them the belief that they had the leader who could lead them to victory during World War II. And during this aforementioned Battle of Britain from 1940 to 1941, there were photographs that surfaced showing Winston Churchill in a very dangerous place. That is, a building that was just below the action that was taking place in the skies above. And when these photographs surfaced, many British people were astonished that they had rarely ever seen a world leader that prominent being in such a dangerous position where he could potentially lose his life. But yet, what these photographs came to symbolize for not just the British people, but for all Allied soldiers, was that their leader had resolve and had strength and knew that even with some risk came the ability to empower, came the ability to get people to believe that at this time, when the hopes of the Allies were swinging in balance, they needed a leader who did not have or had the fortitude to be able to demonstrate the strength of leadership necessary to go forward. And according to a July 14th, 2012 NPR column, they note that many people during this time believed that Hitler was invincible, that his armies could not be stopped. And it was only due to Winston Churchill's strength, his use of military tactics, not just in the battlefield, but relaying those tactics to people throughout his speeches, that he was able to make a case and was able to impassionately defend the righteousness of his cause, to be able to allow the British people to feel empowered, and the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and the Royal Army to be able to defeat this great and terrible leader. And so, through the leadership of this one man, we saw the great myth of Nazi impenetrability be destroyed. Now that we've taken a look at the legacy and the accomplishments of Winston Churchill, let's now conclude by seeing why he deserves this award. The Most Courageous Leadership Award is one that is not given to just the average person. This award is given and is given throughout a long history of individuals in the darkest times, leading people not just to victory, but to a better, more prosperous life. And so this award encapsulates the actions of leaders who led their respective countries or their respective groups through trial and tribulation to success. This award was first given in 1450 to posthumously awarded Joan of Arc. It continued throughout human history and was most prominently given in 1865 to Abraham Lincoln. This award was last given in 2012 to Nelson Mandela, former president of South Africa. And so, as you can see, Winston Churchill belongs with the recognition of these people. And so he is long overdue for being given this award, especially given the fact that he was the shining light of hope during World War II. When much of the world was in the darkness of despair, he gave the world hope. And so, for his work, not just in the United Kingdom, but for empowering and setting the precedent for world leaders throughout the history of time, he is more than worthy of this award today. And so today, what we've seen is that the legacy, the accomplishments, and the award of the most courageous leader should definitely go to Winston Churchill. And so at this time, I would like to invite Mr. Churchill, who is cryogenically frozen, to then come back on stage and appearing today just as he would when he died at 90 years old. And so on behalf of every family member, Englishman, and member of the free world, I am honored to present the Most Courageous Leadership Award to Winston Churchill.